Recording in progress.
Good morning to those in the United States and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and around the world. I'm Georgette Mossbacher, Board Director and Co-Chair of 3C's programming here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2021 Central Europe Conference. Here at the Atlantic Council, it remains our core conviction that a strong transatlantic relationship is the backbone of a rules-based international system. And we recognize the importance of US relations with Central Europe as a core aspect of the transatlantic relationship. This region is a testing ground for transatlantic resolve, continually faced with a wide range of challenges to its security, economic prosperity, and democratic future. At the same time, Central Europe is an area of immense opportunity. Throughout the week, we will address ways our communities can unite to build resistance and economic growth, enable innovation and digitalization, develop capacity for energy independence, seek defense cooperation, and secure a common way forward for the European project. We have assembled the best thinkers and leaders from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss this during this year's Central Europe Week. The sessions will aim to leverage this expertise and work toward real progress. And I hope you are all looking forward to an interesting series of dialogues. I'd like to turn now your attention to our first panel of the week on responding to the transatlantic challenge that's presented by Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. The EU has accused Lukashenko of fueling illegal border crossings into Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania in retaliation to EU sanctions. And although he denies these accusations, the migrants stranded at the border are creating dramatic challenges for the EU and a humanitarian crisis that deserves a response. The world is watching. As former US ambassador to Poland myself, seeing this unfold is deeply concerning. This crisis affects all of Europe, and today we will discuss how the transatlantic community can best respond. We are in real time right now, I think, really witnessing the weaponization of human tragedy. And coupled with that is the fact that we are really limited in our responses. However, I hope these are some of the questions that we'll take up this week. And to that end, I'd like to give a special welcome to the deputy ministers joining us here today. And I want to thank the German Marshall Fund of the US for co-hosting this opening panel with us. I'd like to now turn it over to Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, to moderate our conversation. Melinda, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mossbacher. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have a chance to speak with representatives from Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The situation in Belarus is very tense right now, so we're really grateful that you could spare the time, gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. I have His Excellency Arnoldas Pranckevičius, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs from Lithuania. Welcome, sir. I have His Excellency Marcin Shidacz, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from Poland. Welcome, sir. And finally, I have His Excellency Andreas Vilsums, Undersecretary of State and Political Director from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the Republic of Latvia. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Let's jump into the conversation. Deputy Minister Shidacz, I'd like to turn to you first. We know that most of the migrants are coming to Poland and that the situation on the border between Poland and Belarus is very tense. There are approximately 3,500 migrants stuck between the two countries now. There are reports that Belarusian forces are pushing them to the Polish border. What is your government doing to de-escalate this situation, and what can the West do?
Well, thank you very much for organizing this very timely and important discussion, and thank you very much for having us all together today. And let me also express my gratitude to Ambassador Mosbacher for her warm welcome and the good introduction to our discussion. I want to be clear, precise, and frank. What Poland is facing today, together with our neighbors, Lithuania and Latvia, is an unprecedented organized hybrid operation planned, orchestrated, and carried out by the Belarusian regime. Thousands of migrants have been gathered along the Polish border, mostly. At first it was the Lithuanian and Latvian border, now it's mostly Polish border. Every day groups of them try to break through the border fence and get into Poland and other EU countries. All these actions are supervised by Belarusian soldiers and security services. In fact, just as we speak, a large group of migrants moved towards the closed Polish border crossing point in Kuźnice. It is believed that the migrants were told by the Belarusian services about the possibility of entering Poland's territory illegally through that border crossing point. The Belarusian side is deliberately escalating the situation, unfortunately using human beings as pawns. It has also been brought to our attention that Russia's involvement in this entire hybrid operation is very likely. The situation is unprecedented and unpredictable. For the first time in the recent history, the authoritarian regime uses migrants as both shields and bullets in its hybrid operation against democratic countries. So far, Polish border guards, supported by soldiers and Polish and police officers, prevented assaults on the border, but more such attempts can be expected. We registered several serious incidents, for example, hitting our borders officers with rocks, pointing guns, or shooting the signal flag towards them, simulating shots or shooting with blanks. Moreover, on one occasion, Polish security services spotted a couple of men in uniforms with long rifles already on the Polish territory. Unfortunately, the risk of escalation is real and quite high. Polish soldiers and border guard officers are facing aggressive and violent behavior of frustrated Belarusian military and secret service officers whose reactions seem to be unpredictable. Belarusian hybrid attack on Poland, the entire EU and NATO eastern flank shows how desperate the regime is. In this context, the last NATO statement sent an appropriate message to Belarus and Russia. The North Atlantic Council condemned the continuing instrumentalization of irregular migration artificially created by Belarus as part of hybrid actions targeted against Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. At the same time, we do use existing communication channels to call on Belarusian authorities to stop their hybrid attack on Poland and the entire EU. Unfortunately, the Belarusian answers are a mix of denials, accusations, and open threats. In addition, recent political narrative of Belarus and Russia became again not only very aggressive but also coordinated. Neither Minsk nor Moscow are interested in reducing tensions. On the contrary, they are ready to further escalate current crisis. We need to be ready for this. We also noticed that the migration crisis, artificial migration crisis, parallel with the strengthening of military integration between Minsk and Moscow, indicated yet again that actions of Belarus and Russia are very well coordinated. In this difficult situation, we have to remain, as I said, extremely vigilant, monitor the situation and preserve NATO's unity. We do appreciate, of course, the solidarity shown by the US, as expressed by Secretary Blinken in his phone conversation with Minister Rao. The crisis in Belarus should be looked at also in the context of Ukraine. As a destruction element. We share concerns, in particular in the context of Russia's readiness to use force against Ukraine, as seen as Russia's latest military buildup near the Ukrainian border. We should also look into this situation in a broader picture, also given the fact that at the energy market and the gas market, Russia is also playing its game. So the broader picture, the security situation in the eastern part of our continent has been deteriorating. We should also be looking at this artificially created migrant crisis and the behavior of both Lukashenko and Putin in this context. And that's why Poland has been always vocal about completion of Nord Stream 2, turning a blind eye to Russian aggressive actions and allowing the construction of the pipeline is a wrong decision and sends a very dangerous signal. It weakens the geopolitical position of not only our region but the entire European Union and NATO. We cannot, of course, allow for this destabilization to happen. As Ronald Reagan once said, we maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression. And maybe just to share also our perspective on the goals of both countries, Minsk and Moscow, Belarus and Russia, they are a bit different. Of course, Mr. Lukashenko is taking revenge on us, on the Western community, on the European Union, on sanctioning him, trying to take this revenge on us, to force us in order to accept him as a president of the country. It is also a kind of business for him, since those migrants are even somehow forced to pay a lot of money for such a trip to Belarus. Part of this money remains of course, in Belarus, supporting also the regime. And of course, the main goal is to change the policy of the EU and the US towards Belarus. But for Russia, the goals are a bit different. Russia is very much interested in further destabilization of the eastern flank, especially those countries which are not members of NATO and EU should be, according to Russian perspective, should be back somehow to this gray zone. Namely, of course, Ukraine, Moldova will be further destabilized by Russia. Russia is testing also our crisis management capacity and resilience of our societies, testing our unity as the European Union, as the North Atlantic Alliance, also checking the response and coherence of societies and political class. In my opinion, they've already they started with testing Lithuania, Latvia. Now is the time for Poland as a next actor, next object in this test. So increasing the importance and indispensability of Russia by acting as an impartial mediator. It's a very well-known procedure. Russia has been provoking many crises around the globe by proxy. In Donbass, in Syria, now is conducted. The operation is conducted by Lukashenko, but the profits are, of course, will be picked up by Russia, and now they are trying to present themselves as a possible facilitator of dialogue or the negotiator. We cannot accept that kind of situation. As I said at the very beginning of my presentation, Russia is very much involved in this crisis. Mr. Lukashenko survived somehow this internal crisis after rigged election in August last year only because of the political and not only political support of Russia, and we should all acknowledge that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful, and you were extremely clear about the threat. Let me ask you one quick follow-up question, and then I want to bring in our other two gentlemen. On Friday, 2 airlines restricted flights from the Middle East to Minsk. This will make it much harder for more migrants to come. Does this action essentially solve the supply side of the crisis?
Well, it helped a bit, to stop the irregular migration to Belarus, and it was a good decision taken at the EU level that we broaden also the legal framework. So now we are able to sanction not only the Belarusian entrepreneurs, not only the Belarusian business entities involved in this bloody procedure, but also those airlines which are not based in Belarus. And because of that, because of the let me say threats expressed by the European Union, several airlines stopped direct flights to Minsk. But as we know, regime of Lukashenko has been adopting quite quickly to the new reality. So we can only somehow foresee that he may try to find another ways how to bring migrants to Belarus. That's why we need to continue our pressure exerted on the Middle East countries, on those airlines, in order to fully stop this this procedure. It was a good decision. It's a step forward, but it's not the end of the story, unfortunately.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, that there are other vulnerabilities, and Lukashenko will definitely be looking for opportunities to exploit them. Excellent point. I'd like to bring in the Vice Minister, Pranckievičius. Lithuania has played an active role in trying to resolve the crisis beyond this immediate flashpoint that we're all watching right now at the Polish border. Your foreign minister went to Erbil and has been very proactive. What else can be done to solve the immediate crisis, sir?
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you for organizing this very important debate at this critical hour. First of all, full solidarity with Poland in very difficult circumstance. We're, of course, not only watching with great worry from Vilnius, but giving as much support as we can to our Polish friends. Well, to answer your question, I think there are three things or three avenues which we have to proceed. First of all, of course, to maintain and increase pressure on the Lukashenko regime, and in this regard, today's meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels was positive. The ministers agreed, as Marcin has said, on the new criteria of instrumentalization of illegal migration for political purposes. So we can indeed now sanction individuals and entities involved in this illegal activity. We should go further. Lithuania is proposing not only to sanction the airlines and the aviation sector that is involved, but also to sanction Minsk and other Belarusian airports and their services. We should also create credible threat of further sanctions if the criminal behavior of Lukashenko regime doesn't change. So we should be able to show that we can go further as European Union, also including certain economic or financial measures if necessary, vis-a-vis the regime. Second, of course, important step is to bring more forcefully international community in the humanitarian crisis on the side of Belarus. And we are glad that finally the United Nations, UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, and the Red Cross have been more forceful in pressuring Belarusian regime to have access to the people there, to bring necessary medical and humanitarian support to the people who are in very bad conditions, and which, of course, is very important now, is to work on the possible repatriation, safe return of the people back home to their origin countries. A very important point. Third thing, which is, of course, our long-term ambition together with the allies, is to change and adapt European rules the way we approach migration. Of course, all the lessons of 2015 have not been solved. We have an important pact on the table, European Pact on Migration and Asylum, but we need much quicker solutions. And therefore, the 12 member states, including Poland and Latvia and Lithuania, have addressed the European Commission to come up with legislative and financial proposals how to equip the member states with instruments in these type of hybrid operations like we're seeing today. How to make sure that we can use the Schengen Border Code and the legal framework to defend and protect the external border of the European Union, but also how to have much more effective and quick available finance to finance our external frontier and our common efforts in this regard. So there's many things on our table, and I think this very acute situation has brought the question much more powerfully in the EU's agenda. But also, it's a very important point where we can also deepen our transatlantic cooperation and have also a very important dialogue with our friends in the United States.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's an excellent point. Undersecretary Willemsons, it looks like we have an information problem. Western countries aren't allowing media or aid workers on the border. And we know that Russian journalists are there and they love this imbalance. Doesn't the lack of Western observers on the border open the door to Russia using information as a weapon and telling the story in a way that benefits them? Is there any chance the West will begin to allow Western journalists on that border?
Thank you, Melinda. Well, my take will be maybe a little bit different. Firstly, I think obviously whatever we will do, we will be in a more disadvantaged position than our opponent, meaning a regime of Lukashenko. Our three affected countries, are fighting on the ring with our one hand tied behind our back because of openness and democratic society. So this was that whole calculus from the regime side from the very beginning. They decided this hybrid attack in a way and invented it in a way to try to put us under a disinformation campaign that we will not observe the rights of the migrants. I think this is the first assumption that we have to keep in mind, and whatever we will do, we will be more scrutinized than the Belarusian regime, and this is unfortunate. When I was watching the main Western TV stations over the last couple of days, I think they a little bit go in the trap of Russia Today and Lukashenko regime, focusing mostly on the poor people who are stranded between the fence and between the Belarusian security services. I think we have to change this narrative, but I also believe that it's not fair really even to compare our approaches and Belarusian approaches. We very well understand and know that the information space in Belarus, like in Russia, is controlled and censored, and no media from the West can really freely operate there. And if you will see that the presence of the media is really controlled and directed there, and they are not allowed to report freely and ask Belarusian services opinions or the leadership opinions. You don't see that much on the TV. This is a starting point. My second point would be that still, nevertheless, with all this handicap for us, I would say that we're not losing the information battle. On opposite, we're starting to win the information battle. I think, and we don't need to convince the whole world that we are right. It's enough for us that the NATO and EU member states are seeing what's really happening and who is at fault in this situation. And that the UN agencies, including High Commissioner for Refugees, sees the situation as it is. And I think the recent couple of weeks shows that our diplomatic efforts of the three affected countries, and as well as efforts by European Union leadership, has delivered the results. And I think the picture is pretty much correct right now overall. And that the blame is towards the Belarus, and they are being exposed. This is good, and it's more important also that it's not only what the Russians or Belarusians would call Belarusian regime. I mean, would call collective West. You see also Iran, Iraq, Turkey being more more active on diplomatic stage. On the media and on our side, I can speak, of course, only regarding my country, Latvia, and it's not correct to say that they cannot access. Yes, you are right that since introduction of this emergency situation in August on our border, there is a limited movement in the area of 2 kilometers where the Belarusian activities are taking place. But these certain limits on the movement for persons are necessary for all agencies to be able to prepare properly against potential attack from the Belarus. There are a lot of our intelligence agencies working. There are a lot of our security personnel from defense ministries, from interior ministries working. And obviously, we don't want to give any information superiority to our opponent and them to know everything that we are planning in order to counter their hybrid activities. Nevertheless, we cooperate closely with aid agencies and humanitarian assistance organizations and NGOs. They are present, they are cooperating with our border guards and our border guards cooperating with them. They are present weekly in our government committee, which discusses the situation on the border. So there's constant cooperation and coordination with them. And with respect to media, I haven't heard that anyone from international media would have had problems of visiting Latvian border. Everyone who has asked have got the access. I would say actually that there was not there was a limited interest from international media of what's going on our border. I think only from the main news agencies. I'm understanding that Sky News is visiting our border this week. So there are examples. Yes, if you want, you certainly can come and see the border yourself. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate that clarity. Vice Prime Minister, we have time for one more question. This is for Vice Minister Pranskovicius. Most assume that Alexander Lukashenko is lashing out at the European Union by manufacturing this migrant crisis. But is it possible that the crisis also has a domestic or Russian-facing angle too? Could Lukashenko be using the crisis to sell his country's impending integration with Russia to a domestic audience? What do you think about that?
Well, probably it's difficult for us, to get into the mind of Alexander Lukashenko. It is quite clear that, he is no longer the guarantee of Belarus independence, and we have to clearly say that. He is not only a legitimate leader of his country, but everything he's doing now is actually also running against the country's interest to remain independent and sovereign nation. And of course, we're all observing, the very strong dependence that he is now experiencing from Vladimir Putin and from Russia, and also very, quick integration steps in terms of the union of both states. And I think Marcin very eloquently also described the interrelation and also integration between military and security services of both countries. So there is little doubt that there is a lot of coordination, and I would still think that the key objective is, of course, to undermine the European Union from within and try to also not only to intimidate us, but to force us to make concessions, to legitimize him as the president, to scale down the sanctions, and to withdraw from our principled position, which of course has not happened, and I'm quite certain will not happen.
Wonderful. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you in particular to Lithuania for the leadership that you all have shown in Belarus over the last year. It's really impressive. Hats off to you. Now it's my pleasure. So thank you, gentlemen. I really enjoyed this conversation. This is not the last conversation, and our eyes are on the situation. And we would love to convene you again in a week or two to see how things turn out. So best of luck, and thank you for your time. Now it's my pleasure to turn the conversation over to my friend Jonathan Katz at GMF. He's going to moderate a panel with 4 fantastic regional experts who are going to tell us more. Jonathan, the floor is yours, sir.
Melinda, thank you. And thank you to the three ministers for joining. I know it's an incredibly busy time for all three and governments dealing with the current situation. Want to thank the Atlantic Council for organizing this with the German Marshall Fund, my colleagues in Warsaw at GMF's office there who played a role in helping pull this together today. And of course, this is such an important topic. We have four panelists today that can expand, I think, on what the three ministers have been talking about. I also want to make a real plug. Obviously, the conversation today is about Mr. Lukashenko, but also Mr. Putin, sort of his role as well in this. And this effort. This week, the Lithuanian government at the end of this week will be hosting a conference, I think very appropriate. There'll be a number of senior officials from the United States, but also in Europe will focus on countering authoritarians. And I think this will be a perfect opportunity in Vilnius this week to continue the focus and conversation, not only on the migrant crisis, was also touched on today, increasing troop levels, security issues on the borders of Ukraine, but also the current gas and energy crisis that is also in the region. So these issues all sort of intersect. And GMF's The Cable podcast will be focused on this issue this week as well, focused on the upcoming conference. But I want to turn to and just briefly introduce our expert panelists that are going to be joining us. We have Dr. Anders Åslund, who's a senior fellow, Stockholm Free World Forum. Anders, great to see you. We have Ms. Katya Klod, who's a non-resident fellow of Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Katya, nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. We have Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director, Eurasia Center, Atlantic Council. Ambassador, great to see you as always. And then Valery Kabelusky, who's a representative on foreign affairs of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's team based in Vilnius, but also seen many times here in Washington, D.C. Valery, great to see you today. Thank you so much for joining us. All of you have just heard the three ministers speak about the current situation on the border, both the challenges that are taking place, also the challenge of actually getting information out that is timely, real, impactful. But I wanted to turn to Larry, if I could turn to you first. It's in sort of listening to the ministers speak, I wanted to ask you, the last question was about Lukashenko turning the attention away from what's happening internally in Belarus, but also what we've seen has been this creeping union between Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Putin. And I thought you would be best. I know there was a lot of thinking about, a lot of concerns about this relationship growing deeper. And you heard the last question that Melinda posed to the minister about these internal issues. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening internally? It's obviously a very difficult situation for Belarusians, especially those seeking for a peaceful transition. You and colleagues have been the front and center of that. So Larry, if I could just turn to you maybe for that update, what's happening, and do you agree? Is this an effort by Mr. Lukashenko to turn attention away from the internal challenges, but also maybe something behind this, which is these issues of a creeping union state?
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for organizing the event and inviting me to join the discussion. The situation in Belarus remains rather complex, and probably the trajectory is negative. The repressions continue, but at the same time, what we see is this crisis at the border is actually diverting attention of the international community from the actual situation. And if you read out the conversation between High Commissioner Borrell with Minister of Foreign Affairs McKay from Lukashenko's team, it shows that they discussed the migration crisis, and McKay confronted Borrell on the sanctions policy. But it didn't seem that Borrell actually mentioned anything about the internal situation, or he kind of reminded about the conditions to normalize relations with Belarus, and these are to release political prisoners, to start a dialogue that would lead to the elections in Belarus. So it seems that the strategy of Lukashenko to divert attention from the internal situation works well. And in addition to that, it seems there is this recurrent theme that it is Russia who is behind the whole effort of Lukashenko. And this is a win-win situation for Lukashenko and for Putin. And I would even say that it is a little bit convenient for the Europeans as well. For Lukashenko, it says like, there is somebody bigger than myself behind the crisis. For Putin, it means that he's omnipresent in the region, and he is masterminding all kinds of crises. And for the Europeans, sometimes it might seem like, well, kind of what can you do with Putin? Kind of this is an obstacle that is insurmountable. Therefore, it is much more challenging for us to address this issue. At the same time, what we have seen is that Lukashenko is one and only who's responsible for the entire crisis from the beginning until now. He has organized, he has orchestrated, and he benefits from this more than anybody else. So we are calling anywhere we go with international contacts to keep attention on Lukashenko's actions. He is the one responsible, he is the one liable for all the implications of this crisis. It doesn't mean that Putin cannot benefit from this. He definitely sees this as advantageous position for himself to advance his own interest. And in just recent days, he had a number of calls with Germany and with other leaders discussing what Russia can do, what Putin personally can do to resolve the situation on the border. And he definitely sees this as an opportunity to create space for himself. And what we hear from our allies in Lithuania, in Poland especially, is that this situation can create additional space for Putin to advance its interests in Belarus. Because if he becomes a mediator, a solver of this crisis, he definitely would want to make sure that his interests in Belarus are strengthened and advanced more assertively. Therefore, it's important sort of to differentiate, to dissect what's going on here, who is the actual responsible one, because this defines what would be the response to the crisis. And another theme that we're advancing all the time is that the response to the crisis on the border will resolve only crisis on the border. You will not be able, until we resolve the situation, the crisis in Belarus in its entirety, we will be able to rule out such possibilities in the future. Because this is not the first time that Lukashenko has challenged international norms and regulations with this migration crisis. Previously, exactly a half a year ago, there was a Ryanair flight hijacking, which was a flagrant violation of international norms. And that was the first one that kind of allowed Lukashenko to spill over the international borders. The response was swift and tough, but not complete. And we see that Lukashenko is pulling out of his sleeve another crisis like this, but he might have another one and more to challenge the EU and the West in general. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I still want to come back to you on sort of this closing relationship and what Putin seeks from Lukashenko. But I did want to, I think pretty important too, because I think you know the modalities quite well. But can you just give us a little sense about how the migrant how it works within Belarus too? We know there have been thousands of migrants. They've been given dollars funding. There've been funding given to tour companies with ties to Belarusian authorities. We know that companies organize the flights and visas, provide hotels and ments, and then transfer them to the Polish border. But what happens at the border? And what do Belarusian officials do at the Polish border? What are the conditions like there that you're seeing? And my question too is, I suspect that Belarusians inside the country are not seeing what are they seeing? What images?
So, well, yeah, the situation on the border has escalated significantly in just 1 week. We've seen literally columns of people approaching the border, and a week ago it ended with people being diverted by the law enforcement, by the military into the forest, and sort of to organize a camp. But just today we see that there are thousands of people kind of assembling at the checkpoint, at the border checkpoint, and already camping there. And so literally what happens is that people have approached these migrants, they have approached the Polish border, and they were met with a range of military from the other side, but they cannot go back either. So they're essentially trapped between two lines of the law enforcement military border guards. So it creates a rather tense situation on the border. Definitely, this seems like a deliberate escalation of the situation, and there are some arguments that might explain what Lukashenko is doing and why he is doing this. In the first place, he is afraid that all these people they will not be able to cross the border in the EU. The tactics of Lithuania and Poland of keeping the line and holding the ranks are becoming more effective. So it is becoming more and more challenging to push people through the border. So these people are becoming a burden to Lukashenko himself. He controls the situation in the country, therefore he is responsible and liable for all the things that happen to them. Second is that we are approaching a colder season in Belarus, and many of these people are completely unprepared, and there is no actual infrastructure to keep these people warm and safe in these conditions. So something needs to be done with them before kind of the damage to their health and to their lives becomes unsustainable. And third, I think, is that Lukashenko is also afraid to lose the control over this situation, and he realizes that this increasing contacts between the West and Russia might mean that Russia might play an increasingly important role in resolving this crisis, and he doesn't want that. He understands that Russians will have a bill to produce to him, and he would have to sign that bill. Therefore, this escalation seems deliberate and focused, and definitely that it is very graphic too. It attracts a lot of attention in the international media, again, diverting attention from the dire human rights situation in Belarus itself.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, I wanted to turn to you. Many people are looking at this current situation, not only there, but obviously the situation on Ukraine's borders, the gas and energy crisis, this migrant issue, as serious escalations, concerns that security in Europe is at a very difficult moment, very unstable moment. I know that you're tracking this as closely as anybody, including the troop buildup. But maybe I wanted just to bring you in to speak to where you see this threat level right now. Things are changing a lot on the ground. We have U.S. delegations, including CIA Director Bill Burns, out in Moscow. The U.S. seems to be taking this incredibly seriously, including last week during meetings with Ukrainian officials. Can you speak to what's happening? What's so disconcerting about this moment that you have this type of diplomatic traffic at such a high level? Turn on your mute button. Yeah.
John, the muted. Okay. Very good question. Look, you're right that this is a particularly dangerous moment. You referred to three factors, right? The crisis on the Polish-Belarus border, Moscow's military buildup and tensions around Ukraine, and Moscow's new power in the gas sector because of the bad Biden administration decision on waiving Nord Stream 2 sanctions. All true, very dangerous. But it's also true that each of these specific problems are manageable if the United States and the EU pursue the right policies. And I think you're right. I think the Biden administration deserves serious credit for responding to the Kremlin buildup alongside of Ukraine. You had the Burns trip to Moscow to deliver a private warning, but that did not work. You had a very public warning last week when Blinken and Kuleba did their press conference together on Wednesday. You've since had multiple calls from Blinken to our allies in Europe talking about the Kremlin danger. You had the announcement by the US Embassy in Kiev yesterday about American munitions arriving in Kiev. So we've seen some fairly strong American pushback against any possible Kremlin assault, or rather increased assault, on Ukraine. And I believe we've already seen a positive impact of that. Because Putin 2 days ago was complaining about unscheduled NATO exercise in the Black Sea. And just a few hours ago, he said, well, Russia should not conduct exercises in response. That would just escalate tensions. So I think we're seeing Moscow back off a little bit. And this speaks again to the power of the United States and its allies if we use our advantages to confront Putin when he takes provocative steps. Now, the one place where we have not done that is the gas sector. And this is a very serious problem. When the Biden administration waived the sanctions in May, Blinken said, well, if Moscow does provocative things with gas, we will take note and respond. Well, Moscow's been taking provocative steps with gas since that decision. You have these gas shortages in Europe. You have the Russian effort to put political conditions on supplying gas to Moldova. Even EU Chief Diplomat Borrell called that political extortion. Yet neither Germany nor the United States have spoken up and said that explicitly. This is weakness, and this is something that we need to address as well. But again, if we are as strong on this as we've been on the military side, all of these challenges will be managed because we have great superiority, economic and military, over the Kremlin.
Ambassador, can I just, building on that too, just bring
Please.
in the NATO question too about, are we on the precipice of maybe an Article 4 situation, given the situation on the border? It takes a lot to get NATO to act, but should those that are following this closely, should countries, we obviously have several NATO members whose ministers were represented today. You've been in this situation before. What do you think should be the role of NATO in this?
First of all, that's also a very good question, but I would never connect Article 4 and precipice. Article 5 and precipice, yes, but Article 4 and precipice, no. Article 4, you might say, is approaching precipice. So some folks have been calling, and I know this is true in Poland and in the Baltic states, for use of Article 4. Now, Article 4 is consultations about a situation evolving which could lead to threats to the territorial integrity of a NATO member. So it's kind of a preliminary step before we talk about Article 5. And it's kind of a warning to the bad guys that they are heading into dangerous territory. So I think Article 4 consultations make great sense. There have been Article 4 consultations in the past. Calls for Article 4 consultations in the past. The Turks did this several times, largely relating to problems on its border with Syria. I believe that Poland and the Baltic states talked about an Article 4 consultation when Moscow seized and annexed Crimea in March of 2014. So again, talking Article 4 now makes very good sense, again, as a warning to Lukashenko and to Putin that they are heading towards a dangerous spot.
Thank you. And I'll get my Article 4s and Article 5s right in the future. Wanted to just let everybody know too, you can go to the live stream for anybody who's watching right now, Atlantic Council website under the live stream and ask questions. Please pose them to us. I'm going to turn to Anders next. Anders, I saw you shaking your head when the discussion about this energy crisis came up, and I know I wanted to turn to you and ask you a question about when you look at the situation, you see, I really, in some ways, it's not surprising that Lukashenko has gone this low in terms of exploiting and using migrants to try to achieve political objectives with the support of Moscow as well. There's been a discussion in Washington, I've seen it in the press too, about sanctions and about a next round of sanctions. Obviously, Lukashenko wants sanctions removed. This is maybe part of his effort to try to change the equation. I think very clumsy, and I think end up backfiring on him based on sort of the growing reaction. But I want to ask you about, about a next round of sanctions, what that might look like, and then, what might be something that would be biting for Lukashenko, just in terms of getting both his attention, but also forcing a reaction. And is there a Russia equation to this in terms of sanctions that would have an impact on Moscow's thinking? And I understand this is not the magic bullet to solve everything, but there is all this discussion. And I thought we'd turn to you and ask that question. Anders, over to you.
Thank you, John. I would like to draw on the same line that you and John both talked about, and that is this is not a special Belarusian issue. This is something much broader. It is concerning what we are seeing here is a Russian big offensive against the West on many lines. It's against both the European Union and the US. There is an unfortunate tendency to treat Ukraine as a US issue and Belarus as an issue of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, possibly the European Union as a whole. We should treat it as attacks on the collective West, as official Belarus says all the time now. And we should not call this a migration crisis, because there's nothing natural in it. It is human trafficking instigated by Lukashenko. And it should be treated as human trafficking and not as migration. That, for example, means that these people should not be let in to the European Union, and that the European Union border should be fortified or closed as is necessary. And that leads to a completely different view. So on your final question, I would put it like this. Putin loves asymmetric answers for himself. And the West should respond to this as a Belarusian-Russian provocation, where the gas war is the main part of it, and the migration attack is a second part of it. We have several others, but these are the two, well, of course, the military mobilization around Ukraine. They're all part of one Russian offensive, and Lukashenko just plays a part in it. So we should not treat him as an individual element in it. So the ideal responses would be what Putin does not expect. John already touched upon it, Nord Stream 2. It's obvious that the Russians have used energy as a weapon, a big weapon, since the German-US statement of the 21st of July. So it is illogical if a Biden administration does not waive the sanctions, stop waiving the sanctions against Nord Stream 2 AG. That should be an immediate action by President Biden today. And the other thing is, let Ukraine into NATO, because Ukraine is really standing up for the Western defense against Russian aggression. The Germans should be happy about that, since they don't want to spend more than 1% of GDP on defense in any case, and have a pretty useless defense. Ukraine, a much poorer state, has and half as populous as Germany, has a much stronger defense force than Germany. Here should be a natural cooperation. This, of course, won't happen, but we need to start thinking outside of the box. So back to your question, what will happen now? Well, it's pretty clear that the foreign ministers of the European Union met today. They unanimously decided to undertake certain sanctions, that certain airlines will be sanctions, and that the travel agency will be sanctioned. It's good, but it's not enough. Much more will be done. I like the Lithuanian proposal to turn the whole of Belarus into a no-fly zone. I don't know if it's practically possible. I presume you need to have fighter planes flying over the country in order to make that possible, as was the case in Iraq. But we need to go further and think more broadly about how to stop. I have all along argued that one should sanction Russian financial interests when Russia is operating in Belarus, and there are plenty of them. We are now seeing that Russia is blocking electricity exports and coal from Belarus to Ukraine, and it's also about to block diesel exports from Belarus to Ukraine. So these are all parts of a broad Russian hybrid warfare. And the West, first of all, needs to unite. Secondly, there must be faster action. The EU meet, we see the Minister for Foreign Affairs meeting once a month, and then some working group is being told more or less exactly what should be done. The EU needs to speed up its decision-making so that they can react instantly to Lukashenko's various provocations. And the US has been more or less absent on Belarus. When the EU undertook severe sanctions on the 24th of June, the US came in only on the 9th of August for no apparent reason. And it had much softer sanctions. It did not sanction the leading Russian oligarch in Belarus, Mikhail Godzereyev, as the European Union had done. It did not sanction the issuing of sovereign bonds by Belarus, as the European Union and the United Kingdom had done. So the US is lagging behind, while the US, as you mentioned, John, did a great job on Ukraine last week, while the EU is pretty absent or passive when it comes to Ukraine's response. Well, I was very happy to see the United Kingdom now sending 600 special forces to Ukraine. So the West needs to come together, and it needs to act faster. Belarus, Ukraine, it's all one crisis, and it needs to be treated as one. And of course, we have a problem with Poland that has a lot of problems with the US for wanting to take over the Discovery television channel in Poland. And hopefully that won't happen. And with the European Union for violating the EU rules of law. But here, the EU must and NATO must stand up for Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. If it does not, it becomes dangerous. The worst provocation against Russia, as I think John touched upon, that is the sin of omission, not to do enough.
Anders, thank you. I think you pointed out a number of steps that can be taken by the U.S., but also by others to address this challenge. The concept of unity and determined focus on these issues. You pointed out a couple of things. One, we have sort of global economic challenges as well right now. We have, democracy-related issues, and thank you for pointing that out, because underlying this issue, and I'm going to turn to Katya next, is how the EU is working together with member states to address these challenges. The meeting that took place today, steps forward on Belarus. It sounds, if you're looking externally, it looks very disjointed depending on where you are in Europe, and a joint approach. Oftentimes there's a finger pointing at the US in terms of its strategy and policy, but one can also look at Europe as well and wonder, with a new government coming in Germany, soon to be, I think, within the next couple of weeks, but also the French elections, with the UK detached, how the EU and European member states of NATO are moving forward. Can I bring you into this too, maybe to speak about the approach that you're seeing of Europe to this, and including specifically the this crisis. And Anders, I think you're right too. It's hard, sort of a self-manufactured crisis of those that are being exploited and used by Lukashenko and Putin, to drive a wedge in Europe and with the United States and allies is problematic. So this is something that was man-made by Lukashenko. But can you talk a little bit about these issues? Because on one hand, you could see Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, others have been taking in Belarusians who've been fleeing repression that Larry pointed out over the last year plus. What's going on right now in Europe and how they're approaching this issue? Because there's also concerns about the treatment of these migrants as well. And underlying all this is something that Anders pointed out, which is, these internal rule of law issues within Europe that have created deepening divisions between countries like Poland and Brussels, which makes it much more difficult to react to a challenge like this. And this isn't the first crisis of its kind in Europe too. We've seen this vis-a-vis Turkey, which is different. We know there's differences, which I'll ask, if you want to comment on that too, the difference between, because I think some try to equate the Syria refugee crisis and this current situation, which they're really not apples and oranges. So kind of, can I turn it over to you to walk us through a little bit what you see in terms of Europe's response, but also these underlying issues that are causing problems internally within the EU?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you. I would like perhaps to start with saying that, of course, for the EU, this crisis presents very difficult dilemma, because on the one hand, the EU wants to show solidarity with Poland. It wants its borders to be protected. But on the other hand, of course, Western European governments are very unhappy with how Warsaw, Poland has been treating migrants. And I would disagree here to some extent with Anders when he said that this should be seen only as a hybrid war, because we must also see it, of course, as a humanitarian crisis. It is true that the crisis has been artificially engineered by Lukashenko, but migrants, they are human beings, they're people, and we have to show to them what democratic values are, what European values are. Just a few hours ago, I was asked by the independent Russian television, Dost, what European values are you talking about when we see these horrible pictures, how Poland is using water cannons and firing again above the heads of people. And this is unfortunately what we are now seeing more in the Eastern Europe, these kind of images, where Poland and by the same token, the whole of the EU does not look very good. Under the international law and under the EU law, there is a very clear obligation not to send people back to the countries where they might face danger. And in this case, I'm talking about pushbacks that we have seen Poland has been systematically doing against those migrants who have crossed the border. Of course, you might argue that Belarus is not a dangerous country. It's not as dangerous as Afghanistan, for example, of course, but we do know that the Belarusian security services or army, it's not clear, but the Belarusian authorities, let's put it this way, they're not letting these migrants back to Minsk. They're not letting them back to return back to their homelands. They're not providing with them with any accommodation or with any food. And this is considered to be dangerous. So that practice should be stopped. Whereas, of course, Poland has all the rights to protect its border, but perhaps that should be done in a slightly different way and without using water cannons and doing similar things. So this is one point I would like to make. Of course, it's for Poland, unfortunately, again, some more criticism towards Poland, which is trying to use this as to protect its own interests. And we see very clear, we've seen some statements, for example, by the MEP Beata Szydło, who said that European politicians now see that Poland is defending the EU and European values, and Poland is clearly, as badly as Belarus perhaps, is trying to instrumentalize its crisis to fight with the EU on other issues, and that practice must stop. Poland, the EU should help Poland, of course, as long as Poland itself allows to be helped. Well, first of all, what I mean by this is that we know that Poland has so far not accepted help from the European Border Agency. It has not also accepted any help from the European Asylum Processing Office. And these procedures, I mean, the help from these bodies, it should be accepted as soon as possible, because it's also quite critical to deal with the situation swiftly. So those people who have come, who have crossed the border, and who have found themselves in Poland, they should be provided with some accommodation, with some food, and they also their application should be looked at. And perhaps the majority of people won't qualify for a asylum, and they should be provided with help to return home. And again, experts who are dealing with refugees, they're saying that this procedure might take several months, and therefore it's very important to allow more assistance from the European Union to make this procedure faster, because the temperatures in Belarus are dropping, and Belarus is exploiting the crisis, as is perhaps Russia, who might be behind Belarus, or it might not be behind Belarus, but any sort of provocation is possible. And the longer this crisis lingers at the border, the more difficult I think it will be for the EU to deal with it. Perhaps I'll stop here, then we'll make further comments later.
Thank you, and thanks for pointing out that sometimes these issues can also have a domestic implications. Clearly, the issues internally, rule of law in Poland, differences with Brussels, that this particular issue of migration is a hot political issue in a number of countries, but the need to protect and highlight the values, just as I think these governments have done in bringing Belarusians or Russians, diaspora who fled repression, that these other groups that are coming through are those people fleeing repressive regimes or very difficult circumstances as well, is really important. And I wanted to ask you too, do you see, Gadi, what other type of support? And we got a question in about, are there things that could be done to help Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, in this crisis externally, maybe things that are not being done that could be done to support? We got the EU push forward today on some areas, but also I think you pointed out that sometimes the offer of assistance isn't taken, which would be worrisome if that's the case. And there's plenty of examples too, just based on Belarusians and Russians, about how to help and support those that are fleeing repression. So the playbook is clearly there, including support from the United States as well with these communities too, as we've seen in a number of countries in the Baltic countries, but also those that are fleeing repression. But maybe just give some of your thoughts on this, and if anybody else wants to weigh in. I've got a number of questions from the audience that I'd like to pose to our speakers.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think now the EU, the European Union, and individual countries are doing the right thing in terms of exploring different avenues. Of course, you cannot talk to the Lukashenko regime. The situation in this sense is very different from Turkey, for example. You cannot negotiate a deal, which perhaps what Lukashenko wants, to get a bit of money from this crisis. But you have, in that case, to talk to the source and transit countries, and that's what the European Union seems to be doing. We know that the vice president of the European Commission has traveled to Iraq and Lebanon, and we have already seen some positive signs that certain airlines, they have, for example, forbidden the Belarusian national airline to sell tickets to citizens of Syria, Iraq, and some other countries. We know that some other airlines are also looking at similar measures. So these are all the correct measures. And of course, the sanctions, which you also, Jonathan, mentioned, that's something that should be perhaps stressed and should be very clearly understood by the West, that if Lukashenko feels that he can basically get out from the sanctions by pushing more pressure on the European Union, then he will only continue this practice. So any sign that the EU is prepared to relax sanctions would just boost his position and would give him more courage and boldness to go ahead with some similar policies. And we don't know what he has in mind, but we know that the regime is very bellicose, and the regime can do anything. Maybe some provocations on the border, maybe even go as far as to cut off gas supplies, even though that looks very unlikely at the moment, and maybe they are just mere threats. But nonetheless, the military aspect, I think it's also quite real and quite present in Lukashenko's threats.
I'm going to ask if you to, Kari, just on that last point too, I want to ask about, and Anders, I'm going to ask you about this too, and Larry, if you want to weigh in too, it's just about European unity on sanctions. Is this having any real impact? Do you see within, there's always maybe some weaker links, that maybe capitals that are not as focused on Eastern Europe, on Belarus or Ukraine or Russia. Do you see any weak or any changes or cracks in that unity? Kari, if you want to, or Anders, you can go forward. I just want to respond to what Kari said. Is it actually having any impact on European thinking on sanctions?
Well, if I respond, it's quite striking how unified the European Union has been and how fast it has acted, apart from with the first Belarusian sanctions that came on the 2nd of October last year, and they were held up by one completely disaggregated factor, that Cyprus wanted at the same time have sanctions against Turkey. Something was completely beside Belarus. You can say that Belarus is economically so insignificant that there are no real economic interests that defends Belarus, and those two countries that have had most trade with Belarus are Poland and Lithuania, and they are the most militant. So therefore, it's not a problem at all. Where there has been a problem, that is if you take potash exports from Belarus, 85% of the potash was excluded from the sanctions on the 24th of June in the EU sanctions, because various countries wanted to have their potash coming from Belarus. And Belarus actually produces 1/5 of all potash in the world. And agriculture all over needs it. But then the US sanctions that were adopted on the 9th of August this year, they essentially took care of that, because in order to import potash, you need to use US dollars. More than 60% of all international transactions are done in US dollars. So therefore, the US sanctions came in and nicely complemented the EU sanctions and filled out the loopholes. The economic impact has not been that big. You can say that GDP of Belarus is $60 billion. And a fair assessment is that these sanctions would cost $2 to $4 billion a year. And Russia can easily fill that up, and I think has done so through the various implicit energy subsidies since global energy prices have gone up sharply, and Belarus gets cheap oil and gas from Russia. So that has essentially taken care of it. And with higher commodity prices on the world market, Belarus benefits. So Belarus has had a big increase in its export value, which is 2/3 of it is fertilizers and petroleum products based primarily on Russian inputs. So the economic impact has not been big, but the EU has, with surprising ease, agreed on it, and there's no sign that they will waver.
Global economic challenges really point to how inflation, how prices, how this can impact both Russia internally and Putin's economic calculus, as well as in Belarus as well. Can I ask you too, and I want to ask Ambassador Herbst too, about the likelihood of this threat of cutting off Belarus, cutting off gas transit to Europe. Both of you highlighted the issue of Nord Stream 2. As an issue. First, maybe Anders, just to ask you if and Ambassador Herbst, please weigh in as well. Do you think this is likely? Why not? And I wanted to just as a follow-up to Ambassador Herbst, the U.S. and Germany agreed to address what would be an energy crisis if it came up with respect to Nord Stream 2 transit. We're clearly in that moment right now. I wanted to maybe point to, there's not only is it the U.S. that it was party to that agreement, but Germany as well. And I want to ask you about that, about Germany's response and what you would hope to see. This is a global energy crisis as well, and you see it here, even looking at the pumps, gas pumps in Washington D.C. when I go down the street. So this is a challenge globally. But what would you like to see from Germany? So Anders, maybe if you can answer the question, Ambassador Herbst too, about this gas transit issue. Is this a real threat? And I see this as sort of playing right into the hands of Putin as well. That this wasn't something that Lukashenko or Belarusian government wouldn't have said without direct support from Putin making this threat. So Anders, can I ask you that question?
Putin has made a surprisingly straightforward response, saying no, the transit is not in danger, implicitly saying I'm not allowing Lukashenko to stop the gas transit through Belarus. But on the other hand, it's frequently and rightly said that don't believe anything until the Kremlin has denied it. So I would not take that for granted.
Ambassador Herbst?
There, I unmuted myself. All right. Look, you talked about what Germany should do as well as what the United States should do. The joint statement issued by Washington and Berlin on the gas issue was notable for its ambiguity. And in fact, you had a senior German politician say within a week of that statement that binds, there's nothing binding on Germany. Having said that, Amos Hochstein, the energy envoy for the US, his job is to turn that statement into something real. And I believe if the Biden administration was tough with Berlin and said, look, Moscow is clearly playing gas games right now. Merkel, to her discredit, said Russia has no responsibility for the current gas shortage in Europe, which is simply silly. But neither US nor Germany has called out Putin explicitly for his gas games. Although Hochstein came kind of close when he said this kind of looks like it might be weaponizing energy. But he didn't say it was because there are serious consequences if he says that. But if, in fact, we sent a serious message to Berlin that unless Berlin joins us in pushing hard on Moscow to stop doing this, Nord Stream 2 is kaput. Putin will continue to play gas games. Congress has been watching this closely and is unhappy with the weakness of the Biden administration, which is why the House added to the Defense Authorization Bill an amendment which would sanction Nord Stream 2 without presidential waiver authority. Behind the scenes, the Biden administration is trying to kill that in the Senate, so far unsuccessfully. But I believe the fact that Moscow very clearly was extorting Moldova with gas, and that neither Washington nor Berlin called them on that, increases the odds that the Senate will, in fact, make sure that that amendment stays in the NDAA. But hopefully before that, the strong policy the Biden administration has shown in dealing with the Ukraine crisis, meaning the Russian military buildup, will also appear in its gas diplomacy. But right now we have not seen that, and that's a serious worry.
Larry, I want to just bring you into, we've got a few minutes left, and there's been a number of areas touched on that I know that you've been focused on. One thing I did want to, there was a question posed by someone in the audience regarding whether or not Lukashenko is using this crisis to sell his country's impending integration with Russia to a domestic audience. And there's long been Putin propaganda internally in Belarus for quite some time too, which may be surprising to many who maybe have been following these actions in countries like Ukraine or in Europe or the United States. Can you speak to that issue about how this is being used domestically in Belarus? And then I wanted to maybe just get your thoughts too on what you see as the likelihood of, for example, gas transit being cut, and how you view that with your keen understanding of the economy in Belarus, and how seriously, building on what Ambassador Herbst and Anders spoke to, how seriously should the international community take that potential transit cut?
Thank you, Jonathan. So with regard to the gas transit, I'll start with this one. I think that was improvisation from Lukashenko. Like before, it sounded like that, it looked like that. The reaction from Moscow was a bit of surprise, kind of something like, well, we've seen this thing before, so we're not totally surprised, but kind of why now? And also the importance of Belarus seems to be diminishing in terms of the gas transit area, since the Nord Stream 2 is gaining its importance. So I saw the number that the gas transit through Belarus has fallen already by 70% or something like that. So this means that Lukashenko might be threatening this, both Europe and Russia, but this threat is not as serious or not as kind of overwhelming as it could be before. And Lukashenko also tried to scare others with threats that he might close transit of goods. That happened several months ago, but apparently it didn't resonate really well in Russia and even in China, since it is not only Western Europe that will suffer from such cuts and such blockages, but also these are other partners to the east of Belarus. And it all seems like Lukashenko's kind of pendulum of ideas and fantasies are getting wilder and wilder sometimes, and he is trying to catch kind of through these provocations, through these publicly aired ideas. He's trying to catch something that would actually become tangible, but this time it doesn't seem that it will fly. As for the question how Lukashenko is trying to scare the population, or to use the theme of the integration with Russia in Belarus, he definitely doesn't want to lose sovereignty. I would say to yield sovereignty to Russia, because sovereignty is his insurance to stay in power. And Russians need him in power for as long as there are some with kind of ability to use him to advance Russian interests. But as soon as he kind of exhausts this potential of being useful to Russia, his days might be over in power. And therefore he is both he's playing this dual game of trying to sell to Russia something, but also not trying to sell too much. And we've seen that Russia actually made serious achievements in September, in November, when they managed to extract from Lukashenko agreement to establish 2 Russian military training centers that are actually normal military installations, but not of permanent nature. And the other one is to agree upon, not to sign, but to still agree upon the 28 integration roadmaps with Belarus. Interestingly, nobody has seen these roadmaps, the content of these roadmaps until now, which is unthinkable, even in the democratic government that would have complete authority to conduct negotiations like this. But in terms of Lukashenko, in his situation, he doesn't have the authority. He doesn't have the mandate. He's been disputed all over the place, both internally and internationally. And this idea that he can sell Belarus like this to Russians is appalling to many. But at the same time, this process started in September. In September, they agreed to sign the papers in November. But in November, what happened on November 4 is that they again agreed upon, and he signed something which Putin did not sign. So it is unclear if these papers have been enacted in real or not, or they still need to be signed by both parties. And it seems to be also kind of a game of some kind of a slow walking by Lukashenko while trying to probably see if it will be possible to turn around the situation in relations with the West.
That is indeed something that this issue of Mr. Lukashenko, who's illegitimate right now, signing off on these agreements is something to be focused on by the international community, the United States, the EU, and other partners. We are about to close out, but I wanted to do a quick 30-second final thoughts, starting with Katia, if I can start with you, and then we'll go in reverse and then close the session. Katia, just your final thoughts on this conversation, and thank you so much for joining us, and I wish we had more time to speak.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps I would just add something I did not say before, that we actually don't know how this crisis will play out in Belarus. And very soon, perhaps, the Lukashenko regime might actually have to turn it somehow to try and finish it, because it seems like it's stirring some tension within the country. Belarusian society is overwhelmingly white. It does not have any experience living in multiracial communities. And now it seems with so many people of color, alien-looking people to the Belarusians being inside the country, there seems to be already some friction, some misunderstanding. And for example, today Lukashenko already was talking in slightly milder tones about the whole situation. And even the spokesperson of the Belarusian Foreign Ministry said that we are prepared to do something about that. That might be just rhetoric. But I think Lukashenko did not really realize that the whole crisis might turn against him, and he might be trying now to wrap it up with whatever means are available.
Thank you. A good point about how this is impacting domestically, and maybe Valerie, I welcome your thoughts too about how a different government might approach this type of challenge internally, a different government in Belarus. Can I turn to Anders next, just for your final thoughts, and if there's anything that you feel like you missed and sort of wanted to weigh in on?
Yeah, I think it should be mentioned that Secretary Blinken, was it yesterday or the other day, expressed strong support for Polish Foreign Minister Rao with regard to this drama. I find it very important that the US engages, so that the EU is not left to deal with the Belarusian drama on its own.
Ambassador Herbst?
I spoke principally before about the crisis of Russian escalation in Ukraine, but I said I thought things were heading in the right direction. I think the same is true on the Polish-Belarus border for a similar reason. There's been a pretty strong response, I think, especially from the EU, also from Great Britain, and also to a lesser extent, from the United States.
Valerie?
So I would like to kind of point to this observation that migrants are flocking to Belarus, but not flocking to Ukraine or Moldova to cross the border with the EU. So apparently that this crisis belongs, the authorship belongs to Lukashenko and Lukashenko only. Second is that the sanctions regime from the EU, while rather united and more or less consistent, but at the same time remains rather weak. There are excellent options to strengthen this sanctions regime, and the state-owned banks that control over 70% of the financial market in Belarus is one of them. It is a fairly easy target for the EU and for the United States, and that can cripple the economy of Lukashenko at once. And third is the issue of illegitimacy of Lukashenko and Russian willingness to exploit this. Unfortunately, until now, we have not heard from the United States or from the European Union a clear signal to Russia that what they're doing is illegal. They're exploiting the weakness and isolation of Lukashenko, which is self-inflicted, to advance in Belarus. Russia is not a benevolent player in Belarus. They want to abuse the weakness of Lukashenko to their own advantage at the expense of Belarusian people. And stronger position of the United States and European Union is much needed here.
Larry, thank you for that last point. We've reached our time limit, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you to the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Polish government officials who participated, Melinda Herring, the Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund in the United States, Denise Forst-Thurber, and Doug Klain. Thank you so much for your role in pulling this together. Clearly, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, challenge not only the issue on the borders, but many of the things that were pointed out by all of our panelists about the challenges in the region, the need for a collective transatlantic response, a consistent and sort of focus and attention on these challenging issues. I once again want to thank everybody for joining us. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to everybody's questions that were posed, but we will hopefully be back again at some point to answer these questions. So I want to wish everybody a good rest of your morning if you're in Washington, and those joining from Europe, a good afternoon and good evening. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you.